I woke up to the shrill sound of my phone ringing, Jane's number flashing on the screen. Dread coiled in my gut as I answered, her venomous voice slicing through the line. "Pack your bag, Sarah. Mark's through with you. We found someone better, so there's no point in crying now." My heart sank, but a flicker of defiance ignited within me. After all I'd sacrificed for this thankless family? "I won't leave until we bury Stan, and I settle a few things. This isn't over." I hung up, hands trembling. Marrying Mark had been my greatest mistake, blinded by the hope of giving his daughter Ashley the loving home I'd craved. But his mother Jane's iron grip on the family had steadily crushed that dream, reducing me to a glorified maid. I dragged myself to the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee offering little comfort. Stan's faithful golden retriever Bailey nuzzled my hand, his warm eyes conveying a sympathy this household sorely lacked. As I stroked his fur, I steeled myself for the emotional onslaught to come. The day passed in a blur of funeral preparations, punctuated by Jane's scathing remarks about my inadequacies as a wife. Mark remained emotionally distant as ever, while Ashley openly mocked my grief. Only Stan's hallowed presence in the silent casket brought me solace. At the wake, I found myself unconsciously gravitating towards Stan's bedside photographs, treasured images of the loving grandfather he'd been before illness stole his vitality. In those final months, our bond had blossomed from my role as his caregiver into a friendship forged by shared suffering. Amidst the hushed condolences, a firm hand squeezed my shoulder. I turned to see Lawyer Jenkins, Stan's trusted confidant, his somber gaze conveying a world of meaning. "He prepared for this," he murmured. "We'll discuss it soon." Those cryptic words offered a glimmer of hope, but Jane's incendiary glares reminded me that this family's axe would fall swiftly upon me once the niceties concluded. Perhaps Stan had foreseen their treachery and made provisions, a lifeboat in this turbulent sea of heartbreak and deceit. As mourners trickled out, I lingered beside Stan's casket, gently brushing away a stray tear. Though the path ahead seemed bleak, a renewed determination took root. Whatever storm loomed, I would weather it with the same resilience that had carried me through life's earlier tragedies. Stan's gruff voice echoed in my mind. "You're tougher than you look, kid." With a steadying breath, I vowed to honor the faith he'd placed in me, no matter how turbulent the days ahead might be. I settled onto the worn couch, cradling a steaming mug of chamomile tea. Even its soothing aroma couldn't dispel the ache that had taken root ever since that dreadful phone call. As the rain pattered against the window, memories of my tumultuous past resurfaced, unbidden. "Sarah, honey, you've got to pull yourself together." My Aunt Maggie's voice rang in my ears, as clear as the day I'd arrived on her doorstep at 16, clutching the tattered remnants of my childhood. "Your folks wouldn't want you moping around feeling sorry for yourself." I'd nodded numbly, my parents' sudden passing still an open wound. With no other family, Aunt Maggie had taken me in, her tough love the anchor that kept me from drifting entirely. Those first few years had been a blur of grief counseling, part-time jobs, and fighting to keep my grades up amid the emotional turmoil. But Aunt Maggie's watchful guidance, coupled with an indomitable will I'd inherited from my father, had propelled me through the darkness. "You've got to make your own way, kid," she'd said gruffly, stubbing out her cigarette. "The world ain't gonna hand you nothing on a silver platter." Her words had rung true through the grueling years of physical therapy school, working double shifts at the diner to make ends meet. But I'd clawed my way to the top, fueled by a burning drive to craft the stable life I'd been denied. That's what had drawn me to Mark. His daughter Ashley's haunted eyes had mirrored my own orphaned youth. I'd been determined to spare her the same loneliness that had nearly consumed me, resolving to create the nurturing family I'd craved. How tragically those noble intentions had been perverted by the corrosive influence of Mark's mother Jane and her incessant belittling. With each snide remark, each deliberate slight, she'd chipped away at my sense of self-worth. "Did you really think someone like you could be part of our family?" Her nasal whine grated in my mind's ear. "You're nothing but a charity case, letting us support you out of pity." I forced the memory away, fingers tightening around the ceramic mug. Jane's disdain had only been exacerbated by Ashley's escalating cruelty. My treasured childhood keepsakes inexplicably misplaced, the framed photos of my parents somehow accidentally shattered. Mark had been my sole ally in those dark days, his smiles and squeezes of reassurance the only thing anchoring me amidst the emotional tempest. Yet even his support had waned as the years wore on, his commitment to appeasing his domineering mother slowly eclipsing the vows we'd sworn. I sipped the tea, its warmth a fleeting comfort. While the path before me seemed daunting, Stan's parting words remained a rallying cry. I may have been the underdog, battered and browbeaten, but the same fighting spirit that had delivered me through life's earlier trials was still alive. "This isn't the end," I murmured aloud, as if uttering the vow could render it real. Not by a long shot. Whatever treachery Jane and her cohorts had concocted, I would meet it head-on with the same resilience that had defined my journey. They'd sown the wind through years of emotional torture. Now it was time to reap the whirlwind. The rhythmic beeping of the machines provided a somber soundtrack as I gently sponged Stan's withered arms. His labored breaths rattled in the stillness of the bedroom we'd converted into his sick room. "Easy there, kiddo." His gravelly voice broke the silence, his trembling hand patting mine. "You've got to take it easier on yourself. Jane and that wretched brood of hers aren't worth this much fuss." I managed a weary smile, brushing a damp strand of hair from his brow. "You know I can't do that, Stan. You're the only one in this family who's treated me like, well, family." He harumphed, those rheumy eyes holding a glimmer of tenderness. "Ain't no fault of yours this sorry lot turned out so sour. If I could do it over again." His voice trailed off with a wistful sigh. In those unguarded moments, I caught fleeting glimpses of the past that weighed so heavily on him, the long hours invested in his medical practice, the slow fracturing of his household as his wife and children's bitterness took root. "I won't let you bear this burden alone," I said firmly, meaning every word. Stan's gruff humanity amidst the relentless cruelty had been my sole lifeline these past few years. He squeezed my hand, his gaze earnest. "Mark's gonna try to turn you out soon as I'm gone. You know that, don't you? Already got the papers drawn up to cast you aside like some busted piece of equipment." First, my throat tightened at the casual viciousness, but I gave a resolute nod. "Then we'll just have to make sure that doesn't happen." A ghost of a smile played across Stan's lips as he patted my hand again. "Let me tell you a little story about this prissy little tax inspector who came sniffing around a few years back." I settled in to listen, savoring these moments of wry camaraderie and hard-fought wisdom. Whatever challenges loomed, having Stan in my corner was the greatest reassurance I could ask for. In the days that followed, I doubled my efforts to ease Stan's discomfort, our conversations taking on a bittersweet poignancy. Whether regaling me with pranks from his medical school days or offering nuggets of unexpected life advice, he seemed determined to share every scrap of himself before the end. The night I found him slumped over his bedside table, I thought my world had shattered irrevocably. "Stan! Stan!" I shook his shoulders frantically until those eyes flickered open, his breathing shallow. He gripped my arm with surprising strength, his gaze boring into mine. "Sarah, you listen to me, you hear? I'm leaving you set up proper." A racking cough cut him off as I fumbled for the emergency call button. "Save your strength, Stan. The paramedics are on their way." He wheezed, mustering what little remained of his formidable will. "Don't." Another cough racked his brittle frame. "Don't let them." I squeezed his hand, blinking back hot tears. "I won't, Stan. I promise." Those cloudy eyes held mine for a heartbeat longer before rolling back in his head. Grief engulfed me, yet within its depths smoldered a renewed determination, a promise to honor his faith and make good on those vows, no matter who stood in my way. His final, wheezing exhalation marked the end of an era and the beginning of my war against those who would see me crushed. The days blurred together into an endless cycle of medications, sponge baths, and Stan's labored breathing. I clung to his bedside, savoring each lucid moment like a priceless gem amidst the fog of his deterioration. "You're doing great, kid." He'd rasped those words repeatedly, his papery hand enveloping mine with a surprising warmth. "Don't let them grind you down, you hear?" I'd nod mutely, throat constricted by the emotion those simple reassurances stirred. In those moments, Stan's rough compassion outshone the cold indifference that had seeped from the rest of the household. Jane's periodic sweeps through the sick room were accompanied by her trademark snide comments about the stale air and my apparent incompetence. Honestly, Sarah, couldn't you have opened a window? Or did they not cover basic hygiene in that cow college you attended? Mark would trail in her wake, features etched in discomfort, whether from his father's condition or his mother's histrionics, I could never tell. His gaze would slide past mine, our once warm connection frayed by years of eroding resentment. Ashley, for her part, made no attempt to mask her disdain for the grim realities unfolding. I can't be around all this dying oldness," she'd sneer, flouncing from the room with a roll of her eyes. It's like totally morbid. Only Bailey, Stan's faithful golden retriever, provided a constant, uncomplicated source of comfort. He'd settle at the foot of the bed, his liquid brown eyes fixed on Stan's withered form as if standing in unwavering vigil. In those still moments, I could almost convince myself that affection still flickered in this hollow shell of a home. Then, one leaden afternoon, chaos erupted, Stan's heart monitor shrilling as his frame contorted with a massive seizure. I shouted for help as Jane and the others came running, profane curses spilling from their lips. The paramedics arrived with practiced urgency, blocking me from reaching Stan's convulsing body. Through the tangle of limbs and shouted orders, I locked eyes with him for the barest instant, those cloudy irises holding a lifetime of rueful regret and a silent plea. At the hospital, a grim-faced doctor briefed us in terse clinical tones about Stan's catastrophic stroke and diminishing oxygen levels. The prognosis was grim. Even if he regained consciousness, his quality of life would be severely compromised. "What about extraordinary measures?" Jane cut in, her voice shrill with insistence. "Surely there are procedures." The doctor raised a hand, shaking his head. In cases this severe, it would only serve to prolong the inevitable pain and suffering. I would advise exploring palliative options and preparing for... No, Jane's shriek lanced through the hushed waiting room. "He's not giving up that easily, not while I still need..." She caught herself, shooting a furtive glance at the doctor before smoothing her face into an unconvincing mask of grief. I watched in sickened silence, the grotesque reality finally crystallizing. They didn't care about Stan's comfort or dignity. He represented their final hope for securing an inheritance, no matter how much suffering it cost him. My hands clenched with impotent rage, even as Jane turned those glinting eyes upon me in wordless warning. 2 days later, the machines powering Stan's ravaged form finally fell silent. As his loved ones clustered around with practiced solemnity, I felt his spirit release in one final sigh of liberation. The shackles of their greed forever broken. My role as caregiver had ended, but a new passenger had boarded this runaway train of heartbreak and betrayal. Cold, implacable vengeance. Jane's cruel gaze drilled into me like a dagger's point, but this time I met it with steely defiance. "Pack your things and get out." Her nasal tones cut through the stifling air like a scythe. "You're utterly useless to this family now." A tremor of grim satisfaction coursed through me as I straightened my spine. "I'm not going anywhere," I said quietly, "until we put Stan to rest, and I settle a few scores that are long overdue." I stood my ground as Jane's face purpled with apoplectic rage. "How dare you make demands after everything we've done for you?" she sputtered. "We kept a roof over your worthless head out of pity." Mark shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Sarah, maybe we should all take a step back and—" "Don't you coddle this ingrate." Jane's shrill tones sliced through his attempts at diplomacy. "I want her out before the funeral. She'll only make a spectacle with her hysterics." Jaw clenched, I fought for composure in the face of her venomous tirade. Exploding in impotent fury would only vindicate her disdain. Ashley sidled up beside her grandmother, smirking derisively. "Yeah, beat it, Sarah. We don't need some sad sack charity case raining on the parade." She snapped her gum obnoxiously. "It'll be a relief not having you moping around anymore." I fixed my gaze on Mark, willing him to reclaim the decency I'd once loved him for, but his eyes skittered away guiltily, and I knew in that moment he'd traded his backbone for Jane's approval long ago. Mustering every ounce of poise, I held up a staying hand. "I'll go once we've laid Stan to rest properly. After that." I let the implication hang, heavy as a guillotine blade. Jane opened her mouth, but whatever retort she intended withered in the face of my resolute stare. For once her raptor glare had found its match. The following days were a study in forced civility and bitten tongues. Only when making the requisite funeral arrangements did our battle lines dissolve briefly into an uneasy truce. Jane may have been a viper, but even she understood the sanctity of mourning traditions. The memorial service itself was a grotesque pageant filled with Jane's crocodile tears and fulsome eulogies that made a mockery of Stan's memory. I sat hunched in the front pew, fists clenched as she droned on about what an exemplary father and provider he'd been. The hypocrisy oozed like runny eggs, and I fought not to retch. Behind me, Ashley's theatrical sobbing left damp patches on the shoulders of her overpriced dress. Only Mark's face remained impassive throughout the garish display. Finally, blessedly, it ended. The somber procession trailed out, leaving me alone to crouch before Stan's simple oak casket. With trembling fingers, I traced the carved initials as a lifetime of memories cascaded over me. His gruff chuckle, the gleam of mischief in his eyes, the quiet pride as I mastered caring for him. "You didn't deserve this circus, Stan," I murmured, fighting the sting of tears. "But I'll make it right, no matter what it takes." A faint scuffing behind me broke the reverie. I turned to find Jane framed in the vestibule, those hawkish features arranged in an expression of patented disdain. "I want you gone in the morning," she pronounced flatly. "The lawyers will be in touch about finalizing the inheritance?" My voice sliced through her words like a scalpel. "Yes, I imagine there's much to discuss on that front." Her brows knitted in bewilderment as I rose fluidly and brushed past her without a backward glance. Let the crones stew in impotent confusion for now. Soon enough, the tables would spin with such ferocity that even her unfeeling heart would reel. Tomorrow was the first day of a new future, one built from the wreckage of their betrayal. I only hoped Stan could see it unfurl from whatever tranquil beyond he now occupied. As I exited into the brisk evening air, Lawyer Jenkins materialized from the shadows like a wizard conjuring from the mist. "Shall we take this to my office, Miss Turner?" he murmured, those glinting eyes holding a universe of secrets. I nodded curtly, falling into step beside him as the sky surrendered to an inky everfold of possibilities. A tense silence hung in the air like a suffocating fog as we assembled in Lawyer Jenkins' austere conference room. Jane's eyes bored into me with the intensity of a laser cutter, daring me to make the first incendiary move. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, loosening his tie as beads of sweat gathered on his furrowed brow. For once, the smug veneer had cracked to reveal the fissures of doubt gnawing beneath. Ashley was a study in affected nonchalance, idly buffing her nails as if this legal showdown was merely an inconvenient hiccup delaying her next Instagram selfie session. I met their subtle provocations with an impassive mask, allowing the weight of their impatience to escalate the slow drip of unease. Finally, Jenkins cleared his throat and slid an official-looking dossier onto the table's polished surface. If we could attend to the matter at hand. He lifted his gaze to Jane, who was practically vibrating with accusatory zeal. "This is outrageous!" She sliced the stale air with a bony finger. "That woman has hoodwinked you into some kind of illegitimate inheritance claim using God knows what lies about my poor Stan's mental faculties." Mark opened his mouth, but she barreled forward with the force of an avalanche. "We have documentation proving our legal standing as next of kin. Whatever schemes she's concocted, they won't stand up to." "Madam," Jenkins' mild tone nonetheless carried an adamantine edge, "if you'll permit me." He withdrew a sheaf of papers, placing them squarely before Jane's mottled glare. "These are the legal adoption papers signed and notarized by your late husband over a year ago. They clearly state his intentions to establish Miss Turner as his legal heir and beneficiary." You could have heard a pin drop in the ringing silence. Jane's mouth worked furiously, but only garbled stammers emerged. Across the table, understanding bloomed like a cesspool on Ashley's face as she gaped at the documents in revulsion. "No." The whisper was a strained rasp of disbelief. "That crazy old bat couldn't have." Jane slammed her fist on the table with a meaty thump, sending a litter of pens skittering. "It's a forgery. Everything she's done since worming her way into our lives has been a ploy to swindle my family's rightful inheritance." With a weary sigh, Jenkins produced another folder, extracting a handwritten letter that he slid towards Mark's ashen countenance. I regret this letter was necessary, but given your, shall we say, troubled family dynamics, your father insisted on making his wishes explicit and legally binding. The lawyer's gaze flicked to the apoplectic Jane. He knew there would be unpleasantness. As if in a trance, Mark's hands slid the correspondence closer, his eyes devouring each looping scrawl of his father's unmistakable penmanship. I could practically see the ground crumbling from beneath him, eroding every plank in the platform he'd so meticulously constructed around his hollow existence. It can't be, he rasped, anguish twisting his features. Jane snatched the letter with clawed fingers, gulping furiously as the damning text sank its hooks. A ghastly shade of puce crept up her jowls as the true extent of the reckoning became apparent. "You vicious little harlot!" She caterwauled the words in a glass-shattering screech, spittle flying. "You conniving, gold-digging witch! I'll see you destitute on the streets before—" Her scream was severed by a violent coughing spasm that racked her frail frame. Jenkins calmly proffered a glass of water, which she swatted away with disdainful fury, only to crumple into a pathetic, wheezing heap. The inheritance. Ashley's soft murmur was a blade in the unnerved silence. All those plans, all that money, gone. She turned her gaze to me, naked hatred scorching like twin blowtorches. "You hateful bee. That's quite enough." Jenkins rose smoothly, his tone hardening like carbon under compression. "Miss Turner's legal position as primary beneficiary of the Turner estate is incontrovertible. I suggest you come to terms with that fact and avoid further unpleasantness." The dagger of his stare leveled on Jane, still drowning in her anguish and rage. I held that malignant glare, allowing a fleeting glimmer of vengeance to glint in my irises. It was a meager victory, the opening salvo in a war that still loomed before me. But by God, I would savor it. This was just the beginning of my long-overdue retribution. The Turner clan's reckoning had only begun to unfurl. The weeks following that fateful meeting passed in a blur. Jane's mewling pleas for leniency fell on deaf ears as I steadfastly severed every slimy tendril still binding me to their toxic orbit. "Sarah, please?" Mark's voice had taken on a plaintive, haunted timbre as the reality of his situation congealed into inescapable truth. "We can still work something out, for old time's sake." I fixed him with a level stare, allowing the memory of every slight, every callous disregard for my humanity to galvanize my resolve. "Old times are precisely why there's no going back, Mark. You revealed your true self long ago. I'm just honoring that reality." His shoulders slumped in naked defeat as I turned and walked away without a backward glance. Any residual embers of affection had long since turned to ash on the pyre of their betrayal. Ashley proved equally obstinate in her desperation, resorting to the only arsenal she knew, petulant tantrum and hollow manipulation. "You have to help us," she'd wail into the phone, her words slurring from whatever substances she'd been abusing to dull the pain of facing consequences. "We're going to lose everything. The house, Mom's stupid little shop, everything." I'd remain impassive, allowing the silence to underscore her spoiled pleas until she'd erupt in a torrent of profanity and slammed the receiver into oblivion. Let the brat drown in the miasma of her own making. I'd sung that siren song too many times to capitulate. Only Jane's fall from delusional grace carried any flicker of satisfaction amidst the morass. Once a vision of coiffed entitlement, her threadbare existence now consisted of a grim rotation of court appearances, creditor houndings, and desperate schemes to forestall the terminal diagnosis of poverty. "You don't know what you're doing to this family." She'd rage fruitlessly whenever our paths briefly merged. "Once the money runs out, you'll have destroyed us. Is that what you want, you miserable wretch?" I'd simply gaze at her impassively until her tantrum momentum burned itself out, leaving her haggard and panting on the cold reality of her own poor life choices. It took months, but slowly the tumorous mass of their financial ruin metastasized. The estate dwindled to a parody through reckless borrowing, till even the rambling house I'd endured so much misery within was repossessed. The day the moving vans rolled up to dispossess them of the roof over their heads, I felt nothing. No elation, no pity, no scintilla of regret, just emptiness. Through the plate glass window, I observed Jane's waxen pallor as the last vestiges of their tawdry legacy were boxed and hauled to parts unknown. Beside her, Ashley openly wept, huge, gulping sobs of the perpetually indulged. If I squinted, I could almost discern the faintest shimmer of a smile haunting Mark's hollow features. Some tiny fragment of his soul had welcomed this karmic absolution, this cleansing gale scouring the rot from his cloistered existence. As the trucks rumbled away, belching diesel exhaust, I allowed a fleeting reverie, Stan gazing down with a craggy half-grin and an approving nod for the protégé who'd carried his final sacred trust to its inexorable conclusion. The sun dipped low, banishing the departing caravan of change in ruddy brilliance. A new era beckoned on the molten horizon, and I turned to greet it with a lightness I'd never permitted myself in this waking purgatory. In the distance, a solitary bird issued a soaring, hopeful cry of liberation. Or perhaps it was merely the rusty gate of my personal jail finally swinging wide. The crisp autumn breeze carried the faint tang of wood smoke as I pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Rehabilitation Center. My pulse quickened with a mixture of reverence and determination. This hallowed ground represented so much of what I'd sacrificed, but also the promise of a new beginning. As I strode through the gleaming lobby, well-wishers and former colleagues emerged like a receiving line of ghosts. Polite smiles and handshakes blurred in a kaleidoscope of vague familiarity, until finally, mercifully, I found myself ensconced in the hushed sanctuary of my new office. The diplomas and certifications arrayed on the walls seemed to gaze upon me with mute approval. Reverentially, I traced the raised lettering of my physical therapy credentials, hard-won talismans that had been denied their full potential for far too long. A gentle rap forestalled any more introspection. Marcy, the center's merrily plump administrator, poked her head through the door with a warm smile. "All settled in and ready to get cracking, I see. Wonderful to have you back on the team, Sarah." I returned her smile, the first genuine one to grace my lips in recent memory. "It's great to be back home where I belong, Marcy, though I can't promise there won't be some adjustments." She gave me an appraising look, eyes twinkling with humor. "I have it on good authority. Those famous Turner stubbornness genes have been passed along to the next rightful heir." A hearty chuckle escaped before I could stifle it. How strange and wondrous to experience such uncomplicated camaraderie again, without the lingering stain of bitterness souring every human interaction. As Marcy's ample form retreated, I settled into the supple leather chair and allowed my gaze to roam the empty office that would soon become the launchpad for my own personal renaissance. After years treading the threshing floor of misery and despair, I now commanded the territory of my own redemption. The hours melted away in a flurry of unpacking, form filing, and preparation for the imminent influx of new patients. With each passing minute, I felt the weighty shackles of my imposed identity steadily loosening their rusted grip. Sarah Turner, beleaguered ex-wife and victim. Those ashes had fueled the fire that would give rise to the radiant, self-actualized phoenix emerging from the cindered residue of oppression. I straightened the simple nameplate centering my new desk, permitting a sense of hard-won pride. The low December sun bathed the room in a warm, rosy glow as the day's final appointment wrapped up. I lingered for a few stolen moments, breathing in the atmosphere of freedom and purpose that still carried a heady novelty. A kernel of wistfulness tugged at the corners of my heart as I traced the names and numbers meticulously scrawled in the logbook, each one representing a battered psyche or broken body yearning to be made whole again. The whir of tiny wheels preceded Ruthie, the center's endearingly chatty custodian, as she trundled her cart full of cleaning supplies through the doorway. "You're still here, honey?" she asked with a sunny smile. "Figured you'd be halfway to that fancy new condo you're moving into by now. With all the celebrating, I bet you've got planned." I chuckled at her irrepressible assumptions. "Nothing too fancy, Ruthie. Just taking my first real deep breaths of freedom." The older woman's eyes crinkled in empathy as she nodded. "Ain't no better feeling in this world, sweetie. You just keep on breathing that good air and letting the light shine on that pretty face again." As she bustled onward in a wake of lemon-fresh fragrance, I allowed those simple words of hard-won wisdom to permeate my very core. For so long, the veil of toxicity had obscured the path stretching forth, its twists and turns obscured in murky vapor. Now that fog had parted to reveal a shimmering vista, its horizons rippling with infinite permutations of potential redemption. My fingers tightened around the leather-bound datebook, a fierce sense of clarity washing over me. No more hesitation or existential pondering, no more cowering in shadowed corners. This was my life's chronicle. And from this chapter forward, its pages would blaze with the brilliance of 1,000 conquering suns.